this bill.
Chris Hipkins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I just want to make a point following on from Tim McIndoe that I think it is important we remember, and that is that qualification completion or full course completion and completion of learning aren't necessarily the same thing. People can complete parts of qualifications but not complete the whole qualification for a variety of reasons. And sometimes there are really good reasons why people don't complete an entire qualification. They might go into a qualification and they might upgrade to another qualification. So they might start with a fairly low-level qualification and then find that actually they quite enjoy it and they move up to a higher qualification. That is successful. They may begin a qualification in workplace training, which then leads them to think about their career, which involves them then moving on to another job, a better job, where they're doing a different qualification or they're doing some different form of training. That's a successful outcome. The fact that they haven't completed the specific qualification doesn't mean there hasn't been value from them engaging in that qualification in the first place. And I think that's actually a really important point to remember, because actually when we're looking at the workplace training, getting people engaged is the first priority. Getting people doing learning in the workplace, that's important. And sometimes that will mean that they switch to some other qualification or some other form of training to that which they originally enrolled in. We shouldn't discourage that. In fact, that's quite often a very welcome thing. So I do agree that there's huge room to improve qualification completions, no doubt about that. But if that's the only measure we potentially say to some of those people who are actually moving out of one qualification pathway and into another without first completing it, that's the wrong thing to do, when actually sometimes that is the right thing for them to do. And you know, not completing their qualification, if they're going on to something bigger and better, that's actually a good thing, and we should celebrate that and recognise and reward that. The Labour Party is opposing this piece of legislation for two main reasons. The first is the decision to allow industry training funding to be given directly to companies, corporate entities, employers, rather than to industry training organisations. And the second is the removal of the skills leadership function from ITOs. I worked in the industry training field for a period of time, nearly 2 years. It was a very rewarding and eye-opening experience for me, and I guess the first thing I did was work at the Industry Training Federation, where I was involved in researching and writing the history of industry training up to the beginning of the 2000s. So looking at how we had gone from the previous apprenticeship system through to having ITOs in the first place. And what was very clear there was that there were some great strengths of the new industry training system, but that there were some weaknesses. The way the new system was established by the then national government, let's not forget that this was put in place by the national government, Bill Birch, Lockwood Smith, etc. There were some great strengths in that system, but there were some weaknesses, and one of them was that there was a huge emphasis on anyone could set up an ITO. Bill Birch admitted that he went around the country and said, you have everyone can have an ITO, everyone sets up their ITO. So from the beginning, it was about numbers. It was about getting more people into ITOs, more ITOs set up everywhere, rather than looking at some of these more strategic questions, which in future years, governments, the last Labour government looked at it, and this national government are looking at it. That wasn't the case early on when the industry training system was established. So that was one of the first things that came out of my early work in industry training. Then I went to work in the oil and gas industry and was primarily working for one of the largest companies in New Zealand in the oil and gas industry. And by process of deduction, it's not that difficult to figure out who it was. But what was, that's right, I won't, my good friends the Greens have forgiven me. But what is absolutely clear from that experience was that the large multinational company that I was working for in the oil and gas industry were actually much more interested in qualification portability within their own company around the world globally than they were about qualification portability within New Zealand. So if you think about why we have an industry training system in New Zealand and why we have a qualifications framework in New Zealand, a lot of it's about ensuring qualification recognition of skills that's transportable, portable across businesses in New Zealand and across different jobs. One company, if they are given the money directly to provide their own training on site, and so on, they're going to be more interested in using that as much as they can for their own competitive advantage. And that means that there's potential for them to be aligning that training more with their internal, and when I say internal, I mean their globally internal systems of training and qualification requirements, rather than ones that are going to make those employees readily transferable amongst different employers within New Zealand. So the question that I have to ask is, why should the taxpayer pay for that? If the qualifications and training that are taking place within an individual company are specific to that company and are basically training requirements that company would have to be doing anyway with those employees regardless, why should the taxpayer be subsidising that? We subsidise industry training through industry training organisations because we recognise that that has value for this country as a whole, for having a skilled workforce, skills that can be transferred, skills that can move from one employer to another. When we start giving money directly to companies themselves rather than through a structured industry body, we start saying that those things aren't as important. And I don't agree with that. What I think we could see here is companies using taxpayer subsidies for health and safety training and so on, that they have a duty and an obligation to pay for and provide as good employers. Why should the taxpayer be subsidising those things when that is part of the cost of them doing business? If those are the minimum requirements that they have to have just to operate, then they should be paying for that. And I think that's one of the issues that is very lacking from this debate. Why the government have not made the case for why giving industry training funding directly to businesses rather than through ITOs is going to lead to better outcomes. I'm not convinced from my own experience working in industry training that that's going to be the case. There is a shortage of skilled tradespeople in New Zealand, and the national government have certainly exacerbated that by their current approach to industry training funding. We have seen the loss of thousands of people in apprenticeship positions, and the fact that the National Party woke up to that in January this year after being in government for 5 years is a very welcome thing. But had they not implemented many of the policies that they've implemented over the last 5 years, then maybe we wouldn't be in as much of a position with that as we are now. So, for example, look at the modern apprenticeships. There were between 2009 and 2013, there was a 20% drop in the number of modern apprenticeships and a 37% drop in the number of industry trainees. It's easy to improve completion statistics and so on when you push a whole lot of people out of their training, but actually we should have been looking at the reasons why they weren't completing, because as I said right in my first comments, sometimes there are good reasons why they're not completing their training, and I think simply damaging the credibility of the entire system because of that isn't necessarily a good thing. We should never forget that it was the National Party in the 1990s that did away with the old apprenticeship system in the first place. We should never forget that. I think sometimes well, it was vandalism, but I think sometimes when people talk about that, they forget about what was put in place, which was the industry training system. And I am a big fan of ITOs, having worked in that sector. I do believe that ITOs provide a very useful contribution, but there's no doubt that in that hurried transition between the old apprenticeship system and the establishment of new ITOs, that an awful lot of expertise was lost and an awful lot of momentum from various industries was lost, and it has taken quite some time for some of them to get back on track again. So we're still suffering from that legacy in the 1990s, those decisions made by the then national government. Finally, I've only got a chance to touch on it very briefly, and that is the removal of the responsibility for ITOs around skills leadership, setting leadership for their industry. If they are not going to do that, who is going to? Why is the government going to invest a whole lot of money in industry training if we don't know that that's actually what the industry needs? That's got to be a fundamental question. We're very, very bad at workforce planning in New Zealand in terms of making sure we've got the right people with the right skills at the right time. We've never done that very well, but taking responsibility away so that no one's actually got any responsibility for it is not the right thing to do. In fact, industry training organisations were probably only just coming to grips with the significance of that role. They'd only had it for a relatively short period of time. and they are only just coming to grips with what providing that kind of leadership to their industries actually meant, and that's now being taken off them. And I think we should actually have strategic leadership around skills. I think the ITOs are the right people to be doing it. I think this is very short-sighted, and it's another one of those things where someone will look back in 10 years' time and go, oh gosh, wasn't that a mistake? How have we ended up in the position we're in now? And almost certainly some of the problems that we'll be facing in 10 years will be traced back to this bill.
The clock expired some time ago. Sorry. Simon O'Connor.
Mr. Speaker, we've heard from a number of people today on both sides, actually, that this bill